Welcome to the world of business and global markets, Chapter 11. At the end of this presentation, you should be comfortable with your understanding of the importance of global trade, be able to discuss the roles of comparative and absolute advantage in global markets and global trade, be able to discuss the two indicators for measuring global trade, be comfortable in explaining different types of trade protections and trade agreements, be comfortable in discussing the different strategies for reaching global markets, as well as with explaining the forces affecting trade in the global market. The first step, though, is why is it important? And business in the global markets is important because during the last half of the 20th century, many barriers to international trade fell and a wave of firms began pursuing global strategies to gain a competitive advantage. However, some industries benefit more from globalization than others, and some nations have a comparative advantage over other nations in certain industries. To create a successful global strategy, managers must first understand the nature of global industries and the dynamics of global competition and global business. Global business itself is defined as any activity that seeks to provide goods or services across borders. It does not always have to be a large company, as we may often think. There's also the issue of exporting, which is the selling of products in another country, and importing, which is when you buy a product from another country. We touched briefly on why trade globally. And the reason for trade is a country cannot possibly produce everything it needs. Even if it could, other countries would want to trade with it. Some countries have an abundance of products and know that other countries need them. A well-designed global strategy can help a firm gain a competitive advantage. The advantage can arise from some of these following issues, such as efficiency. By scaling the economies from access to more customers and markets, by exploiting other countries' resources, labor, raw materials, you could extend the product life cycle and sell older products to lesser developed countries. You can also have a little bit of operational flexibility by shifting production as cost exchange rates, etc. change over time. There's also strategy issues, risk issues. You can diversify the risk by opening up in different markets. So, for example, you could open up and spread out the operational risk where labor problems, earthquakes, or wars provide less of a risk. There's also the chance, the opportunity to broaden your understanding with the learning opportunities due to the diversity of operating in different national markets and the global markets. There's also the issue of free trade. Now, free trade is defined as the movement of goods and services among nations without political or economic trade barriers. We'll talk more about that later on. But first, before we do that, it's important to touch base on something I mentioned, and that would be absolute and comparative advantages. Comparative advantage is where a country should sell the products it produces most efficiently and import those goods it cannot make efficiently. For example, Iceland should export fish but import oranges, since they cannot produce oranges effectively because of the weather. There's also, in addition to comparative advantage, there's absolute advantage. An absolute advantage occurs when a country has a monopoly on producing a specific product, or is able to produce it much more effectively. For example, in many Middle Eastern countries, they have an absolute advantage on oil. Some parts of Africa have an absolute advantage on the production of diamonds. So when we're looking at all of these issues dealing with global trade, it's important also to look at, well, how can we measure global trade and see if it's to our advantage, not to our advantage. And some of the ways we can measure it are through balance of trade, trade surplus, trade deficit, the balance of payments. And just like with everything else that we're going to be talking about this semester, it is important to recognize that while we're trying to have free trade and we're trying to be fair in each market we operate in, not all not all organizations or all national markets are going to operate fairly. So we have to be cognizant, we have to be familiar with the idea of an unfair trade practice. For example, dumping occurs when a company sells products in a foreign market for less than it can produce. And as a result of subsidies and where there is a goal of driving local competitors out of the market, an organization or a national market might take part in dumping. There's also gray markets, which occurs when the flow of goods ends up in other distribution channels other than the one intended. For example, when makers of iPhones sell them unlocked to unauthorized distributors, or when the gray market might get a hold of bootleg copies of movies in China and then export those bootleg movies to other national markets. And because that unfair trade practices take place, that has spawned the idea of trade protectionism. And trade protectionism is when countries use protectionist policies to try and protect domestic trade. For example, you have tariffs. You have harmonized tariff schedule, where a schedule that includes tariffs for every product from every country. And again, tariff is a fee charged on a good being imported into a country. There's also an import quota, meaning that a country is going to limit the amount of a certain type of a product that can be imported from a specific country. There are embargoes, which is a ban on imports of a particular product or even a ban on any trade with a country. Sometimes this is done for political reasons. Up until recently, we have had a complete trade embargo with Cuba because we don't agree with their governmental policies. There are also non-tariff barriers. These include anything else that makes it hard to trade with a company. For example, you might require a specific type of packaging in order to import. Denmark, for example, requires all butter sold in the country to be in little containers as opposed to the regular tubs that we see them in. With trade protectionism, it's important to go, okay, well, who is overseeing to see that the trade is being taken care of fairly, and who is going to be taking a look at the different types of trade protections and trade agreements to make sure that they're not creating an unfair advantage. The first one is the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. The WTO now oversees this agreement and was intended to create trade opportunities between countries. The WTO is the goal is to eliminate trade barriers and encourage trade between countries. Many people disagree with the WTO due to environmental reasons, labor reasons, and the dominant developed countries, in some views, have more power in trade talks. A common market is a group of countries that work together to aid trade and reduce barriers between member countries. For example, you might have the European Union. The European Union is a unification of many countries in Europe with the goal to eliminate barriers to trade and to make them more competitive to trade. For example, individually, the countries were not as powerful and could not have as much control over the policies when they were going up against, for example, the United States because of the size of our market. So the European Union, by joining together, they can have a greater amount of power and greater amount of control over trade policies. They have a common currency with the euro. And many new countries are constantly trying to enter into the European Union and must meet certain economic restrictions such as the GDP in order to be part of the European Union. There's also OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. It unified petroleum policies and found ways to stabilize if not fluctuate, oil prices and provide a fair return on their capital. There's also the idea of NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which aims to reduce trade barriers between Canada, Mexico, and the U.S. Over the years, some have said that NAFTA has caused job losses as jobs have gone into Mexico for cheaper labor and looser environmental standards. And when we're taking a look at the different countries and the different markets, we need to take a look at some of the strategies to reach foreign markets. There are a number of different ones, and the idea is to take a look at the different modes of entry into the market and see which one can offer you the best advantage, the best access in, and the best, most efficient way of operating in that foreign market. For example, you have licensing, which is an agreement where a company is allowed to produce a product and sell it, providing a royalty to the other company. You could enter into a new foreign market by way of exporting, selling direct products to another country. Many intermediaries are available to help with this who know the market, the laws, and trade restrictions. There's also the idea of franchising. Franchising is an agreement between two businesses for one to allow the other to use its name, trademark, and concepts. For example, if you wanted to open a McDonald's in a foreign country, you might do it by way of franchising, where somebody in a foreign market would agree and pay you a fee to be able to open up the franchise. There's also the idea of contract manufacturing, which is an agreement for one company to produce a product for another under their private label. As we talked about earlier, there's the gray market. This is often how a gray market can happen, when a company produces but sells to someone other than the company they contracted with. There's also joint ventures or strategic alliances, and that's when two companies agree to work together on a specific project for a specific period of time. It can be an advantage if a company doesn't know how to do business in another country and they can team up with a company already doing business there. There's also the idea of foreign direct investment, which involves opening direct operations with another country, such as production facilities and offices. A greenfield investment is a similar concept. It can be risky, very expensive, and companies don't normally do this until they know the market very well. So it's important when you're taking a look at entering into a foreign market that you know the pros and cons for these different types of operations. For example, a joint venture might be favorable when the partner's strategic goals converge with their competitive goals. While their competitive goals diverge, the partner's size, market power, and resources are small compared to the industry leaders, and partners are able to learn from one another while limiting access to their own proprietary skills. Whereas problems with a joint venture might include conflict over asymmetric new investments, mistrust over proprietary knowledge, performance ambiguity, how to split the pie, for example, lack of a parent firm for support, cultural clashes, as well as the issues of if, how, and when to terminate the relationship. So it's important to take a look at the different pros and the different cons for each of these, and you have to look at more than just your operations, but also you have to look at the operations and the business environment and for the market in which you're looking to relocate. For example, exporting. The advantages are it minimizes risk and investment, gives you a speed of entry, maximizes scale using existing facilities. The disadvantages, though, are you need to take a look at the trade barriers and tariffs. They can add to the cost of the product. How much is it going to cost to transport the product to the foreign market? It also limits your access to local information and a company using exporting could be viewed as an outsider. With licensing, it minimizes risk and investment. It does also have a speed of entry, but you have a lack of control over the use of assets. A licensee may become a competitor. You might have a limited license period. When it comes to direct investment, you have a greater knowledge of the local market and can better supply specialized skills. You can also be viewed as an insider for that foreign market, but it has a higher risk than other modes and requires more resources and more commitment. And it may be difficult to manage the local resources. So it's important for a business to take a look and do their research. And this comes up the idea of the business environment that you're going to be operating in the foreign market. You have issues in the foreign market such as socio-cultural. In order to be effective at selling products or services overseas, a business person in business must understand these factors. Religion, how people communicate, human resource management, generally just speaking, the way that people do business with each other, how the country looks at life and what it values. There's also the issue of economic and financial environment. Exchange rates are a concern. Since they can change, the value of the price of a good or service can go up or down. Business people also need to be aware of pricing strategies before selling their products overseas and taking into account the exchange rate as well as the economic stability and the financial stability of that foreign market. There's also legal, regulatory, and physical and environmental issues. For the legal and regulatory environment, businesses doing business overseas must know the laws and rules before engaging in business elsewhere. For example, in China, the laws concerning property ownership rights are quite different from the rights that we have here in the U.S. And you also must make sure that when you're dealing with legal and regulatory issues, that you don't just follow just the laws in the foreign market, but also the laws in your home country, the U.S. You can get into big trouble by making the assumptions that everything is the same as it is where you are used to doing business, since every country has its own set of laws. One of the examples of this involves a billion-dollar company, Huntsman Organization. He was opening up a joint venture with Mitsubishi in a foreign country, and it was very common for that country they were doing business in to accept bribes. And the Huntsman Corporation, that's not something that they utilize as part of their global strategy. So once they found out that they would need to continue to provide bribes, Mitsubishi was kind enough to do it the first year, then they immediately terminated their contracts, lost millions of dollars, and got out of that market. Now there's the physical environmental market also. What is the understanding of the access to electricity, the quality of roads for distribution centers, the infrastructure that it comes to being able to take care of the business that you need to take care of. In addition to those environments, it's important that you take a look at all of the business environments that were discussed in Chapter 1, because they apply just the same way to the global environment. You need to take a look at all of the issues. So now we're going to take a look at the future of global trade. So global trade, there's always going to be new and expanding markets. Technology is always improving, technology is always changing, and it is making trade easier and easier. Communication technology has made it a lot easier for businesses to take care of what they need to in foreign markets. So rather than by using regular mail to send information, emails can make processing of business deals much faster. But that brings up another issue. Going back to the business environment, some businesses, they don't mind communicating in some aspects through electronic communications, but they have to do business face-to-face. And the future of global trade is going to make the issue of doing your research and paying attention to the business environment much more important. You know, one of the most important things you're going to be able to need to consider when doing business overseas is etiquette, language translations, and cultural differences. Many American companies assume that what works at home will also work overseas. Of course, that just doesn't work, and it can result in serious losses. You know, managers at one American company were startled when they discovered that the brand name of the cooking oil they were marketing in Latin American countries translated into Spanish as Jack Oil. Now, I'm not going to say that other word. American Motors tried to market its new car, the Matador, based on the image of courage and strength. However, in Puerto Rico, the name translated into killer and was not popular as on the hazardous roads in the country. A sales manager in Hong Kong tried to control employees' promptness at work. He insisted they come to work on time instead of 15 minutes late. They complied, but then left exactly on time instead of working into the evening as they had previously done. Much work was left unfinished until the manager relented and they returned to their usual time schedule. A Cologne for Men pictured a pastoral scene with a man and his dog. It failed in Islamic countries where dogs are considered unclean. You know, a golf ball manufacturing company packaged golf balls in packs of 4 for convenient purchases in Japan. Unfortunately, pronunciation of the word 4 in Japanese sounds like the word death, and items packaged in 4s are unpopular. So it's important you take a look at the entire business environment, language, cultural issues. You know, you need to look at economic issues such as exchange rates, living wages, you know, human development issues. So it's a very important topic for business where you can gain a very competitive advantage with global trade, but only if you do it properly. If you have any questions about the material, please feel free to give me a call or send me an email or a text. Thank you.